Good. Welcome back to our Foundation Year program and this sixth session with Dr. Joshua Brown, who will be talking with us tonight about Aristotle and the Nicomachean ethics. Joshua, I'm going to lead with the first question. And really, I want to just ask you about Aristotle, the person. You will know that when people know little about philosophy, they often think, I think, of a triumvirate of figures at the beginning of the tradition. So Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. And there will be many people, I think, who assume that in some ways Aristotle is radically different to, or even at odds with, his teacher, with Plato. And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about Aristotle, the man, and Aristotle, the philosopher. Is he that different? What would you like to tell us in the first instance about Aristotle?
Yeah, sure thing. So he was born somewhere around 384 BC in ancient Greece. His father was a physician. And I suspect this had an influence on him because later in life, he did write a lot on what we would call biology. He was really fascinated by studying anatomy and studying organisms, trying to understand how they were structured and composed. When he was 17, he traveled to Athens and he became a member of Plato's famous academy. So this is going to go towards answering that second part of the question. He was very close to Plato. I think he remained in like ongoing contact and dialogue with him for at least 20 years. And as you said, sometimes people like to paint a picture of Aristotle being this kind of rebel who was at odds with Plato and disagreed with him on all sorts of stuff. I don't think that's really the case. There's this fantastic quote from Frederick Cobblestone on that. He says, "The notion that Aristotle was in any real sense an opponent of Plato and the academy, and that he was a thorn in the side of the master is scarcely tenable. Aristotle found in Plato a guide and a friend for whom he had the greatest admiration. And though in later years his own scientific interests tended to come much more to the fore, the metaphysical and religious teaching of Plato had a lasting influence upon him." Now, this is not to say they don't disagree on some things. And I think as we engage in this conversation, you're going to see some, especially as you just finished reading some of Plato in the previous course, you're going to start to maybe notice some areas in which he differs. But this wasn't an antagonistic kind of relationship. I think this was someone who had great admiration for his master and great love for him, and just was kind of furthering that tradition he had of engaging and questioning things, trying to understand the world around him. After Plato's death, his nephew Speusippus became head of the academy, and evidently Aristotle didn't get on well with him. I mean, you can kind of tell from the name, he sounds like a Karen. I don't know for sure, though. I don't think there's any definitive answer as to why Aristotle left, but he did. And that's when, a little bit later, in 343, he became the personal tutor for a young prince named Alexander, who we all know today as Alexander the Great. You can actually see there's a film that was made, it was like in early 2005 or something. It's a terrible film, but it's about the life of Alexander the Great, and Aristotle's in that movie as his tutor. They actually have a bit of that in the film. If you're looking for some kind of contemporary film with Aristotle, I highly recommend the Horrible Histories song, The Greek Thinkers. That's probably the best version of Aristotle in contemporary film. Okay, I say that tongue in cheek. Yeah, so after that, he did go back to Athens, and he didn't return to join back up with the academy there. Instead, he came to found his own school. And this became known as the Lyceum. And it's named this because it was located in the northeast section of Athens. And at that time, that area was known for venerating and worshiping Apollo, but kind of a particular version of Apollo called Apollo Lyceus, which was the wolf god. But this area was also already a place where people would engage in a lot of philosophical debate and argument. We don't really have places quite like that today. Maybe the closest is, maybe sometimes you can go to a coffee shop and you'll have a group of people sitting around discussing something, some book or idea. But it's just a place people would go and hang out and debate and talk about philosophy. In fact, it's even referenced in some of Plato's dialogues. It's the kind of the location where Socrates engages in some of his dialogues. So it makes sense that Aristotle chose this place to start his school. And he founds the school. Once Alexander the Great died, I guess a lot of people weren't huge fans of Alexander the Great. And so because of his close association with him, he had to flee Athens and leave his school. And then he later died just of illness, of natural causes. So that's kind of a brief synopsis of the life and times of Aristotle.
Good, thank you for that. I believe that Daniel may have a question to follow up with.
Yeah, so we had the context there of Aristotle more broadly. And I want to move on now to the text of the Nicomachean Ethic, if that is indeed how you say it.
That's how I see it. So
thank God.
Go with it.
So specifically, firstly, to start with, like the context of, so what is what's the argument that he's addressing? What have people said about this before? Is it something that's a common thing that's discussed? And then also what and who he's trying to address, and then also what is the argument that he puts across that's developing on what's already been said in his argument.
Okay, so yeah, let me, I guess to begin with, I'll try to provide some broad context for Aristotle and his writings to kind of situate this one in. He was a prolific writer. So one of his ancient bibliographers, Diogenes, records that he wrote like over 150 books. And it's breathtaking, the array of different topics he covered. So just like some of these books include things on poetry, rhetoric, political science, biology, anthropology, psychology, logic, metaphysics, ethics, and that's just part of it. I'm not going to read the entire list. Sadly, most of these works we've lost. Now, scholars tend to break these works up into two big groups or kinds. Some of them are that were written for a general audience. They are sometimes referred to as exoteric works. And the others, many believe, are lecture notes that were used for teaching at the Lyceum. Now, here's what's funny. When we read what some ancient authors had to say about Aristotle's writing, they praise it for how beautiful it is. So we have one recording from the Roman statesman Cicero, who he praises Aristotle for his prose and his grace and elegance, and claims that Plato's prose was silver, but Aristotle's was gold. Now, I don't know about you, but I find that rather shocking because the first time I read Aristotle, having just read Plato, as you guys did, I was struck by how bland and terse and boring, it is. I have this quote from Christopher Shields, who's a fantastic scholar of Aristotle. He says, "Anyone who approaches Aristotle for the first time will see immediately that Cicero could not have been talking about the works we read in the canonical Aristotelian corpus." That's what we have today available to us, what we have access to, what's survived history. What we have available to read today is hardly golden. It is instead more often than not crabbed, terse, and initially difficult to comprehend. Certainly, it could not be compared favorably to prose of Plato's dialogues in terms of sweetness and suppleness of expression. So what we think we have left, unfortunately, out of this huge, massive corpus of writings are his lecture notes, primarily. And that's what the Nicomachean Ethics falls into. It falls into this group of writings that were probably sketches of his ideas that he was using to lecture and teach at the Lyceum. Now, specifically looking at the Nicomachean Ethics, it appears that it is one of 3 books. It's probably that he wrote on ethics. And this one is, I think, an expanded version of one of his previous writings on ethics. He fills in a lot of gaps in the previous one. And it's just named after the guy who helped compile and edit the book. So there's no special significance to the name Nicomachean Ethics. When Aristotle wrote it, it wouldn't have been named that. That's the name we've inherited because Nicomachus is the one who put together, preserved the works, and that's what we have today. Now you'd asked some further questions, I think, about, I'm trying to remember what you asked. You said about explaining some of the contents of the book, or how it compares to.
So what argument is it addressing at the time, and also how does it develop on what's he arguing that's developing upon those?
Okay, yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, I think so. I don't want to give too much away because I know as we move forward, I plan to kind of unpack a lot of. There's a lot I can say about some of the underlying ideas and metaphysical principles that Aristotle was assuming when he put forth the argument. So I don't want to say too much. I think to simply answer the question right now, he's kind of what he's doing is trying to explain what it is to live a good life. What is the purpose of our existence as human beings? What are good activities? What are they aimed at? And how do we make moral judgments? Those kind of questions. He's not like today, when you read the debates in ethics and contemporary literature, it's often about trying to find some kind of a moral principle that you can apply in any situation at any time. He's not so much concerned about that sort of thing. He's more concerned about what is it for a human being to live a good life and to learn how to make ethical decisions. That's very practical kind of ethical decision-making and thinking.
Okay, so we've established that in this text, Aristotle really offers quite a detailed account, I think, of what is required in order to be a good person and to live a good life, however we might define that. And perhaps we'll talk about how he defines that a bit later on. So, and you've touched on this already, there are some crucial assumptions about the nature of reality really underpinning this theory of ethics that Aristotle puts forward. And I wonder if you might outline those for us, please.
Yeah, so I apologize up front then, because what I'm about to say in response to that question is probably, it gets a bit technical here and there, but it's kind of hard to avoid that with Aristotle. His ideas are all connected. So if you talk about his ethics, if you really want to understand them, you can't talk about it without knowing a little bit about his thinking in some other areas of philosophy. So for instance, specifically I have in mind here his thinking on metaphysics, which is just the study of the nature of reality, and his thinking on the human soul, what a human soul is. So having a little bit of background knowledge on some of his thinking in these areas will be very helpful for understanding what he's saying in the Nicomachean Ethics. Disclaimer though, I couldn't possibly give you like right now without taking up the entire time. a super nuanced and deep kind of explanation of his entire metaphysics or anything like that. So I'm going to give you a sketch. Hopefully it makes sense. I think the first underlying assumption we need to think about are what he thinks about reality. So what are the basic constituents of reality? In the broadest terms possible, what kinds of entities exist? Well, according to Aristotle, there are broadly two kinds of things. The first are substances. Now, when we hear the word substance, today we immediately think of our chemistry class. You have to put that out of your mind. He's not talking about substances in that kind of way. He's talking about it in a philosophical sense. For Aristotle, a substance is an individual, numerically distinct object or thing. So paradigmatic examples of a substance would include things like dogs or trees or apples or human beings. His thinking about substances, his definition of a substance can be kind of articulated like this. For Aristotle, an entity, X, is a substance if and only if, one, X is not predicated of something else, and two, other things are predicated of X. I'll say that again. One, X is not predicated of something else, and two, other things are predicated of X. Let me give you an example to help you understand this. An apple, for Aristotle, would be a substance. Now, we don't normally predicate of anything else that it is an apple. We generally don't assert propositions like, my dog Frankie is an apple, or that mighty oak tree is an apple. We do, however, predicate things of apples. So we say things like, the apple is red, or the apple is crunchy, things like that. Another way to think of this is the substance is the subject of a sentence, of which things are predicated of. So his thinking is that our language, our thoughts, and our concepts are mapping onto reality. So substances are the bearers of qualities, and they stand in different various relations with things, and they engage in activities. Now, the other category, broadly speaking, would be non-substances. And under this category are a big list of things. There's 9 other things in this category. I'm not going to list all those things, but entities that fall under this category are things that can't exist on their own. They're things that exist in substances. Things like qualities, like being slobbery, like a dog can be slobbery, or being red, like an apple can be red, or quantities, like being 2 feet tall, or positions, like lying on the floor. These non-substances, these kind of things, are predicated of substances. So the definition for that would be kind of like the opposite of what I just said about a substance. An entity X is a non-substance if and only if, one, X is predicated of something else, and two, other things are not predicated of X. So again, we can predicate the property being slobbery of a dog. So when I had my dog Frankie, I would say my dog Frankie is slobbery. When I was a child, my mother used to say that about me because I didn't eat with my mouth closed. Other things are not predicated, though, of properties. So take this example of being slobbery again. We don't normally say things like, the property being slobbery is standing in the corner, or the property being slobbery is 5 feet tall. So I promise you, all of this is going to make sense. You're gonna know why we're talking about this as it relates to his ethics. So just bear with me here. We don't encounter non-substances in the world apart from substances. We don't encounter slobberiness free floating in the world. Rather, we encounter slobbery things like dogs and children. Here's a second important underlying assumption. It's called hylomorphism. And this has to do with, ultimately, with his conception of the soul. So that's why I'm bringing it up. Hylomorphism has to do with Aristotle's conception of substances as composite objects or entities. So according to him, all substances are composed of two things. They're composites of matter and form. Now again, this can be really hard for us to conceptualize today, because when we think of matter, we have this whole history of post-Enlightenment thinking and the scientific revolution, and we have all these thoughts and ideas of what we mean by matter that probably weren't in Aristotle's mind when he was talking about this. A crude way of thinking about matter is that it's just the stuff of which a substance is made. Probably a better way of saying that it's the part of a substance which persists through change. It's the part that stays the same. It doesn't change. The form is the structure, or maybe more crudely the shape, but I like the word structure better, of the matter. But how the matter is configured or arranged. Now this can change over time. And he would further distinguish between different types of form. There's substantial form and accidental form. So the substantial form has to do with that object, that substance persisting as a certain type of object. So for that, say an object like an oak tree, to keep going as an oak tree, it has to at least maintain a certain amount of its substantial form, its structure. There could be accidental changes to it over time, but if it changes its substantial form, it will no longer be an oak tree. The kind of stock example used in Philosophy 101 classes would be something like Michelangelo's statue of David. So think about the matter of the statue of David being like the marble that it's composed of, and then the form being that structure or shape of David. Maybe, you know, if something happened, like a lot of these ancient statues, you know, and sculptures we have are missing bits of arms and things that have fallen off, but you can still see the form, you can still see what kind of statue it is. So there could be things that happen to the statue of David, you know, over time. But let's say someone took a wrecking ball and crushed it and obliterated it, and it no longer had any of the substantial form, then it would still be marble. It would still have some other kind of form, but it would no longer be the same object. It'd be a different substance. Roughly, that's his idea. Now, why are we talking about this? Again, hang with me. This is going to make sense. His theory about substances and his theory about matter and form are underlying his theory of the soul. So he takes human beings to be substances. You and I and everyone, we're substances. We're individual, numerically distinct objects, and you can predicate things of human beings. And we're composed of matter and form. I have the form, the structure of a human being. And this form is what Aristotle would call the soul. So the soul is the form of the human body. Again, this is a lot different from the way we think of the soul. When we think of the soul, we're so influenced by Descartes and his Cartesian dualism. And if you haven't encountered that, Descartes had this radical idea about the soul being a completely different kind of substance, almost, you know, in popular level imagery, you picture, this is where you get all these ideas in movies and TVs of this kind of like glowy cloud-like thing that kind of pops out of you, you know, when you die. That's our conception of the soul. So again, this can be a bit confusing when we read Aristotle thinking, that's the soul? Like that's not what the soul is. He wasn't thinking about consciousness. He wasn't thinking about some kind of glowy, immaterial, ghost-like thing. For him, the human soul was its form, its substantial form. And it's this substantial form, the form of the body, the soul. And I should say, when I say a form or structure, this is a dynamic entity. It's not just a static kind of thing. This is dynamic. It's what informs the body. It's what grounds or determines the range of characteristic activities that human beings can engage in. Now that's a really important point, so keep that in your mind. It also determines the form, or the soul determines the end or purpose for which human beings engage in the different activities we do. So, quick recap. Aristotle has this conception of the world. It's composed of things, objects, substances, and they're doing all sorts of different things, and they stand in different relations with other things, and they have different qualities, and they're composed of matter, and they're composed of form, and this form determines the type of things they can do and activities they can engage in. And for human beings, the form is the soul. And this has to do with the purpose or end of what a human being is. All that stuff I've just talked about, if you don't understand that, the reason why I've talked about that is it's really hard to really get what he's trying to say in the ethics. So I apologize for having gone through all that, but hopefully that makes somewhat sense.
No,
Yes.
it does. And I think Father Plant has a question for you now.
Okay.
Yes, I do, please. But I think before I ask it, we're going to need a bit of going to need to clear up something on terminology, because we've just been looking at the Republic of Plato, where of course the word form has a very different sense indeed. I want to ask something about the form of the good, but first I realise that the form that you're talking about is not idea. It's not form in the Platonic sense. You're talking about morphe. Could you, before I ask the question about the good, could you just clarify the usage of the term form in the sense that you're using it, because it's clearly not the Platonic sense?
Yes, yeah, actually that's an excellent question. I'm really glad you asked it. So you've just come out of reading Plato, and when he's talking about these ideas, these eternal kind of forms, he has in mind something a lot different, and you're exactly right. Whereas Plato's thinking about something that's eternal, that's universal. In fact, it has a lot of qualities that you might think of as like divine type qualities. Aristotle's not thinking about form in that sense here. And you mentioned the Greek word morphe, and you're exactly right. He's using a different term. And it is confusing when we translate these things all as one word, form. It makes it really hard to get your head around. So yeah, Aristotle is thinking about something like structure. I don't like using the word shape, because shape, when you think of shape, you tend to think of something more static, and you don't think about function. But for Aristotle, the form of something is dynamic, and it explains what kind of thing it is, and the things it can do, and the things it can't do, and its limitations. So it kind of has a wider, I guess, semantic range of meaning. Yeah, does that kind of speak to your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you. I think that helps, and it means that I can ask the question about the good, which clearly, what we've seen from the Republic, we've looked at the good as the supreme, as the highest form. Nothing to do with morphe, obviously, nothing to do with these kind of form and matter distinctions. But we've looked at the form of the good by reference to the allegory of the sun and of the cave and of the divided line, the idea of the good giving, being, and intelligibility, and possibly being beyond both. Is that what Aristotle means when he talks about the good? As telos, what is the good for Aristotle? How does it compare with the Platonic form of the good, please?
Yeah, so now you're starting to see some of these differences that I did mention. So obviously he loved Plato, and he's indebted to Plato, but he does start developing his own ideas. So, and this is one of those areas. For Aristotle, when he's thinking about the good, and we're going to see this more as we go on with our talk, he thinks it's best to start by looking at particular things. So in some sense, he's kind of like an empiricist. Now, I hesitate to use that word because there's a lot of baggage that comes with that in contemporary usage. But he's an empiricist in the sense that he wants to start by, let's carefully look at particular things. Let's look at plants and actual human beings and how they behave and their activities. Think about how they're structured. And let's try to arrive at some conclusions about what ends they're aiming for when they engage in activities. And then from there, start talking about, thinking about what the good is for different things, which is a lot different from, I think, Plato, who's, again, like you've already said, he's thinking about the good as this eternal ideal that we're striving to conform ourselves to. We're not completely conformed to it. Whereas Aristotle is thinking about particular objects and what kind of things they're doing, and trying to then from there come up with an answer to what is the good for things. So this is one of those areas where you start to see more and more the gap between their thinking and how they approach the topics.
So the good, is it what a particular thing is good at in its ideal sort of purpose? Is that something like what we're talking about?
Yeah, okay, so you might remember when I said we talk about the form of something determining the types of activities, the range of different characteristic activities it can engage in. And for Aristotle, he sees that every activity that something engages in is aimed at something. Everything has a function. Everything has an end. Now, this is, again, one of those areas that's really hard for us to think about, because we don't tend to think that way as much today. Well, not everyone, because we're so influenced by this kind of scientific materialism that tends to think there are no ends or purposes. There's no, in nature. But that even is beginning to crumble because there's only so far you can go thinking that way. Now, I want to say something too to clarify. Aristotle, he wouldn't be someone who today you might have someone who calls himself like a proponent of intelligent design or something. He doesn't think that way. He's not thinking that there is some kind of craftsman who put together the world like a stopwatch or something, and it has a purpose or an end because of that. He's thinking that things have intrinsically different powers to engage and behave in different ways, acting towards certain ends. And that's an intrinsic feature of substances, and that the form explains. So, in fact, yeah, so you asked the question, what is Aristotle's conception of the good? So I'm going to jump into some of my stuff on that and just, run with it. So you've read this. He says, really early on, he says, every art and every inquiry, every action and choice seems to aim at some good. Whence the good has rightly been defined as that at which all things aim. Now, we can start to see, he's thinking about what are these activities aimed at? What is their end? What is the function of the thing? So that's a really important word. The good, that at which all things aim. For him, though, it's more than that. It's the ultimate end or function or purpose of any given substance. Now, for Aristotle, then, if you want to find the good or the ultimate good of something, you have to consider what we're talking about. Let me step away from thinking about human beings for a second and just think about like an oak tree, because maybe it's a little easier to think about that. An oak tree is a substance composed of matter and form. It has the substantial form of treeness or oak treeness, or whatever you're going to call it. It engages in a range of different activities. And these activities, for Aristotle, they're aimed at certain ends. Such activities as absorbing water and nutrients from the soil, or growing leaves, or what we call photosynthesis today. These very activities are good, according to Aristotle, insofar as they are natural functions of an oak tree that are grounded in its form. So it can engage in these activities in virtue of the fact that it's an oak tree. It's a peculiar kind of characteristic type activities that oak trees engage in. Dogs and cats don't engage in absorbing nutrients from the soil and things like that, or growing leaves, but oak trees do. And it does in virtue of the fact that it has a particular structure. These activities are not the good of the oak tree, though. So they might be good in a small g sense, but Aristotle wants to know what's the ultimate good of the oak tree, right? Or of any given substance. These are small goods, but these goods are not ends in and of themselves. These are functions of the oak tree that are meant to contribute to some other good or some other ends. So engage in the act of absorbing water, let's say, not for the sake of absorbing water. That's not the end goal, right? It's absorbing the water so it can like pass the nutrients on to the rest of the tree. And it's doing that so that it can grow, and then, you know, so on and so forth.
Is this a distinction of causality, efficient, final, and so on, or is that something separate?
Oh yeah, it's in fact, I debated about whether to talk about that as well.
No,
Yeah, you're exactly right. It's tough because his philosophy is, it's just one big system and it's all interconnected. And so I was like, okay, well, how much do I talk about? But you're exactly right. He has this notion of 4 different causes, probably better translated explanation. 4 different ways of explaining things. And yeah, there's, among those, he has a material cause. What is it made of? What's composed of? A formal cause, what's its structure, and that kind of thing. And a final cause, what is it aimed at? What's its function? So when it comes to the good, he's looking at these different goods as functions, activities, and the good of the activity is what it's aimed at. And if it's a natural activity, grounded in the type of thing it is, the characteristic type of thing it is, that's a good. But there's also hierarchies of goods for Aristotle. So there's little goods like that, like, okay, engaging in the act of absorbing that nutrients and water, but there's then other goods, maybe contributing to the growth of the tree, and then that, you know. So he wants to figure out, well, what is the good of something? Now, have that all in mind, and we shift back into the ethics. And he's not concerned with oak trees there. He's concerned with a specific type of substance, human beings. And he wants to know, well, what is the good of a human being? Human beings engage in a wide range of activities, and he starts off, you know, talking about all these things, medical science and sailing and economics and war and all these different arts and sciences and things that people engage in. And he notes, and again, just to keep all this in mind that we've been talking about, his philosophy, how it informs his thinking. He's saying, look, we engage in all these activities for the sake of some end or purpose. These activities are aimed at achieving some goal or performing some function. So, you know, for example, I think he uses this, is when someone's doing something in medical science, they're doing it for the sake of healing someone or making someone healthy, as an example he kind of uses. So it's important to note that these activities, these various arts and sciences, are peculiar to human beings. Because again, in the ethics, he wants to find out what's the good of the human being. And that's tied to the human being's soul. It's the form of the person, which determines that. And these kind of activities, all the ones he's talking about, these different arts and sciences, that's something that's peculiar to human animals. You don't see cats, you know, blacksmithing, or you don't see cats going to war in the sense that we go to war. You see them fighting, but not going to war. And so these are distinctively human activities he's looking at. And he's wanting to look at these things and go, okay, can we figure out what the good is by looking at all these different ends and aims that we're trying to achieve? Why? Because again, for him, unlike Plato, that's where you're going to find the answer. You start by looking at individual things and how they behave and what they're doing. So according to Aristotle, again, kind of like I said for the oak tree, there's a hierarchy of different types of ends or goods that our actions are aimed at. And some of these actions are aimed at ends which are then aimed at further ends. So for instance, you know, I go to work, say, as a blacksmith, and maybe my end goal for the day is to produce a really good horseshoe. But then maybe I have some kind of further end above that, right? I'm not just making a horseshoe for the sake of making it. I'm also making it because I want the horse to be able to walk across whatever difficult terrain and protect its hooves or whatever. I don't know anything about horses, so anyone here want to correct me for what the purpose of the horseshoe is, by all means do. And also there's other ends, right? I want to take care of my family, so I need to make a living. I have all these other goals. So potentially we're looking at this.
I can no longer hear Joshua. I can't hear you. I don't know if anybody else can.
For him.
No, Joshua, that last sentence we'll have to ask you to re-deliver because you went. We lost your sound for a minute.
Oh, I'm so sorry. You'll have to remind me of where I was, or someone asked a question.
We just got to where you were saying there's a kind of hierarchy of purposes, of ends, and you said that the blacksmith might be wanting to feed his family and so on. So how do we get from there to the good? I think that's where you were getting to.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So so I mean, that's really what he's interested in. Is okay. We all kind of are on the same page. I mean, to him, these are kind of really incontroversial claims, right? For him, it's like you look around the world. This is an esoteric philosophy. This is like kind of common for him. He thinks it's very common sense. We see people doing things for different reasons to achieve different goals, and these are the goods for their actions. But then sometimes we try to achieve some goal because we want for the sake of some other goal. And he's thinking, okay, so what is the ultimate thing, right, that human beings are striving for? What's the ultimate goal? That's it. That's like the main goal. There's no other further goal. Like that's the primary one. For him, that's the good. And as if you've read the materials, the first two books, you'll see that his answer to that is happiness or eudaimonia. That's the end goal. That's the main thing. That's his big kind of conclusion there is, what is it that we're all striving for? All these activities we engage in that are uniquely human type activities. What is the ultimate thing we're striving for? Well, it's happiness.
Josh, this sparked my question. And this is where it appeared to me that, as you said at the beginning, or even before we recorded, it sort of became clear that the Nicomachean ethics were kind of, they felt like the lecture notes that somebody took from, watching a professor. He continually asked himself, oh, what then is happiness? We must refine this further. And then 5 pages later, oh, okay, what is happiness? We must refine this further. And then 5 pages later, the same thing.
Yeah.
At the end of all this journey of finally refining what this quality of happiness is that we all are pursuing through all action, how would you describe what Aristotle thinks of as this idea of happiness?
Oh yeah, okay, so this is the big question, right? This is the $1 million question, because maybe you followed him so far. I mean, maybe you've thought, this is common sense. Yeah, I can track with you on this. But then when he gives that answer, well, this end goal is happiness. And you might sit back and go, right, but no one agrees on what happiness is. And you're exactly right. So, he's got pages and pages of trying to grapple with this question of, what do I mean by happiness? What am I saying here? And he's aware. So he's painfully aware that most people don't agree on this. So he gives some examples. He walks through different things. Some people identify happiness with pleasure, others with wealth, others with honor or prestige, things like that. Let's just think about pleasure. That's a good example as a candidate for happiness. Now, Aristotle says, no, Aristotle says pleasure can't be happiness. That doesn't work. Because pleasure is not an end that only human activities aim at. So that's the first thing he would say. Again, he's interested in activities that are unique, characteristic activities of human beings. Now, I had go back to my dog, Frankie. Clearly, my dog, Frankie, was also interested in pleasure. And sometimes he would come and he would roll on his back on the ground, and he really wanted me to rub his tummy because he really thought that felt really great. Now, he and I share that in common because I love I love, you know, someone to rub my hair. So if my wife is like rubbing my hair, I'm like, she makes fun of me and says I'm like a little puppy, you know. So that's something that we share. Dogs, rats, all sorts of other animals engage in activities because they're seeking or aiming for pleasure. Second, pleasure is an end for actions. It's not an in and of itself. This is what Aristotle thinks. He thinks when someone is engaging in activity for the purpose of pleasure, the reason they want that pleasure is because they want happiness. So again, for Aristotle, that's not the ultimate kind of good. It may be a good, a little g kind of good, but it's not the good. It can't be. And so those are the first two things I think that Aristotle would address. He'd say, look, pleasure, he's not trying to minimize the importance of pleasure, by the way. He thinks that, as you might have picked up, he does think that pleasure accompanies what he believes to be good actions often, and pleasure often accompanies happiness. But it doesn't always accompany happiness. And it's not the pleasure that is the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is the happiness for Aristotle. So he goes through reasoning like this. He thinks about honor. He considers honor. He says, well, we can't identify honor with happiness either, because honor is something that's bestowed upon us by other people. And again, for Aristotle, whatever the ultimate good is has to be something and grounded in, ultimately grounded in my intrinsic kind of power, my nature, the form I have, my soul, and its capacities and its range of activities. Happiness has to be something that I am in, that's connected to my activities, my choices, the behavior I'm engaging in, for Aristotle. So something like honor doesn't quite fit the bill. Plus, you might also add that, well, you know, honor as well. We don't normally do something just for the sake of honor, but we want the honor for some other thing, and that's the happiness. And so he goes on reasoning like this. So he thinks that if we want to understand what true happiness is, we have to, again, go back to these unique activities of the human soul. What's peculiar about human beings? What kind of activities can they engage in that other things can't? Other substances don't. Other things like flowers or trees or dogs or cats or hippopotamuses or whatever. What things are peculiar? Well, these are the things that involve reason, right? Behaviors like engaging in various arts and sciences, seeking knowledge and understanding, doing philosophy, this ability to reason, this faculty of the soul to reason, which is a unique faculty that Aristotle believes only human beings have, for the only type of substance that can engage in that type of activity. That's peculiar to human nature. And so for him, he says that's where we need to look at to figure out the good or the end or the ultimate purpose of the human being, to find out what happiness is for the human being. So I have this quote from him. He says, "We posit the function of a man to be a certain kind of life, namely activity or actions of the soul with reason." So that's just kind of restating what I said there. "And of a virtuous man, we posit these to be well and nobly done. So since each thing is performed well according to its proper virtue, then the good for man turns out to be an activity of the soul according to virtue." So eudaimonia, or happiness, for Aristotle, is an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. Another way to think about that is this. To be happy is to function properly, essentially, for Aristotle. A virtuous human being is functioning well. He or she is engaging in his or her characteristic human activities well. And over time, if they're engaging in these activities well and with excellence, being a really good artist or scientist or living a good life in that kind of way, if they're cultivating these activities well, they're going to be happy. They would have achieved this ultimate end or goal because they're functioning properly as a human being. Which, again, this is a completely kind of a foreign way of thinking for a lot of contemporary people. We don't tend to think about how does a human being function properly? What is it for a human being to perform their activities well? And we don't tend to think of that as contributing to our happiness, and and we don't usually think of that as being the good or the ends of human existence. But he does, and it's all rooted in his thinking on the world and how it's configured and how we should understand it. I'll pause here for questions because that was a lot. It was a mouthful.
This would be a good time to kind of transition into Q&A from anybody who has anything. Josh, my worry is that when people think of reason as being the kind of core of the human person, they I don't know if anybody knows Star Trek, the character of Spock, as if to be human is just kind of this cold reasoning about life where you don't feel any emotions and you just kind of coldly reason about things. But he also, when you read the ethics, he has this kind of warm concept of the human person that does involve emotion, feelings about things. How would you kind of dispel this worry that he's trying to create these rationalistic automatons?
Yeah, I think that's an understandable worry. I think it's trying to understand what Aristotle means by reason. Because I'm like you, when I hear reason, my thoughts go to someone like Spock, or I think about logic and sitting around just thinking really hard. Now, to be fair, if you continue reading the ethics, I mean, Aristotle does think that, being a philosopher, thinking about the world and understanding the natures of things, that's kind of like the highest function, the highest kind of good activities that human beings could be engaged in. So he does think in those terms, but you have to also understand he's not thinking of kind of like machines engaging in some kind of automatic, logical kind of like a computer or a robot or like a stoic kind of individual like Mr. Spock. He's just noting that, unlike a dolphin, even though those are really intelligent creatures, unlike a dolphin or some other creature, human beings can engage in things like art, and they can build things and they can think about things. They can come to know the essences of things, understand things, what they are. So human beings can ask questions like, well, what is the nature of humanity? Or what is the nature of an oak tree? What, those kind of questions. And others can't. And so human beings can go to war, unfortunately. Human beings can have disagreements and arguments. Human beings can form political societies and ideologies. All of this stuff is accompanied in the activity of the soul and to reason. These are all the type of characteristic traits of human beings. And he's thinking, well, if you want to be a good human being, you have to find a way to do these activities well. And if you're doing that, if you're cultivating these virtues. And so for him, doing it well, doing it with excellence, it's not a mathematical equation. So, you see that doctrine of the mean. Unfortunately, when you think of a mean, you're immediately going to mathematics and you're thinking of something that's just like kind of cold, logical apparatus he has in mind. He doesn't. He has it more like it's an intuitive thing. The examples he uses would be like, if you want to learn how to be a good painter, you would need to go sit down with a master, right? Someone who's been painting their whole lives, who does it well, who does it with excellence. And as you spend time with the master, copying them, emulating them, you start to engage in that activity well. Likewise, Aristotle thinks ethics is the same, right? We go to the masters, like children, if they have a good example of someone who's a virtuous person, who's doing things well, engaging in human activities well and with excellence, as they copy it, they start learning how to become a master as well. They start learning how to be a virtuous person. And he does kind of picture like, well, virtue is kind of like the middle ground between different extremes of our behaviors. So, and you know, like for instance, the bravery, this kind of stock example. There's two vices, right? There's a deficiency in which we're too afraid to do anything, that kind of cowardice. But there's also foolhardiness, so rushing into things, right? Rashness. So the virtuous man is going to learn how to live that balanced, well life and engage in these characteristic human activities with excellence and balance. So it's not so much like a Spock who's sitting around and everything's no emotion and everything's just purely some kind of a, you know, mathematical puzzle to solve, some statistics to write. You know, Spock's always quoting statistics like, well, there's an 80% chance of survival, so we shouldn't, you know, whatever. And he's going on like that. That's not really what Aristotle's on about. He's thinking more intuitively about how do we learn how to just be a human being well and with excellence. How do we engage in these different things that we can do that no one else can do, no other type of creature can do? How do we engage in them well and with balance? That's what he has in mind. So it's not quite the Spock picture.
Joshua, speaking of virtue, you seem to have the virtue of anticipating other people's questions, but I know that there's one outstanding that Lucy would love to ask, so I'll just invite her to unmute and come in with her question.
Yeah, so it's along, it's on this theme of arete, of virtue, because obviously he identifies different levels of virtue, doesn't he? So you've got your moral virtues, which are to do with the part of your soul which is both rational and irrational. So perhaps you've got a desire pulling you one way, but it's not fully irrational or unconscious in the way that, say, growth is. So you might have the urge to take something that isn't yours, but then your rational part of you can hopefully, if you're a virtuous person, can rein that in. But then you've got the part of you that's purely rational, and that's where these other virtues, such as philosophical contemplation, exist. And so it's curious for me, and I'd like you to sort of solve this for me if you can, please, because I noticed that in Book 10, Aristotle identifies philosophical contemplation as the most perfect or complete sort of manifestation of eudaimonia. So we are flourishing most perfectly and most completely when we are contemplating philosophical truths. And that rather suggests that there are perhaps different degrees of flourishing or eudaimonia, which I don't know if that is the case, because earlier in the text he sort of talks about it as something necessarily complete, hence it's a means and not an end. And I wonder how we might reconcile that, if indeed it's possible to do so.
That's a really good question. I want to start off by saying you can see there with Aristotle that he hasn't, that's an area where you can say, he's still really connected with his master Plato's ideas. Plato is enamored with that philosophy king in that whole picture, you know, from the Republic. And so here we have Aristotle ultimately kind of ending up in a similar place, even though he takes a different, you know, route to get there. Where he's thinking, the philosopher, that's the best, that's the highest form of, that's good news for philosophers, maybe. Maybe not the best message for people who aren't interested in philosophy or don't want to do it for, you know, as the main focus of their lives. As to your question, though, I think that's a challenging one. I want to say I don't want to overstep what I really know and give you the wrong answer. My understanding of Aristotle is that there could be the sense of completeness that you're talking about has to do with, again, the happiness itself, which is something that happens over a period of time as you're cultivating this virtue through your activities. And that could look different for different people engaged in different things. And I think there's still room there for almost that kind of caste type thinking that Plato kind of has a little bit. So for instance, maybe not everyone is capable of, you know, being an Aristotle and engaging in that type of their whole lives in the way he is envisioning. It doesn't though mean that they can't be happy. I think Aristotle would say, no, they could still be happy because they could still, through self-effort and through this hard work, be cultivating these character traits and trying to live well and engage whatever they're doing. So whether they're an artist or a painter or a blacksmith or a scientist or whatever they're doing. They can still try to achieve this completeness of happiness. But you might still be some room there for Aristotle to say, yeah, but there's levels, there's some people who are able to achieve a higher level, of eudaimonia, because they are engaging in these, like you said, these kind of higher level forms of purely intellectual kind of abstract thinking. But I don't want to overstep, because this is getting into an area I don't know as much about, so I don't want to say much more than that because I don't know. But does that kind of help a little bit?
It does, and I think as well it really fits quite nicely with something that he gives a caveat, and he gives the same caveat several times throughout the treatise, which is that we use broad brush strokes, but you always have to bear in mind the particulars and the situational nature of reality when you're considering these things. So I think that makes sense, really.
Okay, well, good. I'm glad at least I was able to answer it partially or somewhat.
Joshua, thank you. I'm just looking around the crowd to see if we have any other questions.
Just to push this idea of virtue, I'm wondering about the kind of conflict that might have occurred in the kind of absorption of Aristotle's idea when the good, there seems to be a kind of vision of the good that relies on thou shalt and thou shalt not, right? And it's kind of this list of, these are the things you can't do, and these are the things you should do. But Aristotle kind of seems to say that there are thou shalt nots. Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not commit adultery. I think he mentions specifically. But was it kind of revolutionary that he had this idea of virtue that was sort of more subtle than just thou shalt not and thou shalt?
I think so. I'm not an expert in this period in terms of knowing a lot about what was, the other thinkers what kind of thinking they were engaged in at the time. But as far as I know, this was a bit different and unique because he was clearly, unlike Plato and previous thinkers, Aristotle was really interested in kind of a scientific, what you might call a scientific approach to the world. He was really interested in kind of starting with looking at things and what kind of things, trying to figure out what they were by studying them and observing them. And from that, deriving ideas about what kind of activities they're engaging in and what kind of functions they have and what their structure is, their form is, that kind of thing. And then trying to build a whole system of ethics from that. I think that's quite unique, and that's had a profound and lasting impact on Western thoughts. I mean, because everyone after is always commentating on Aristotle, and all of their ideas are either trying to correct him or debate with him, or trying to further his ideas and promote them. And we're still doing that today, in a sense. So I think it was novel. It was creative on his part. It wasn't just something derivative he had picked up. I think he was doing something a bit new.
Ask a question?
Yes, please, Daniel.
You've already mentioned there's this sort of perhaps that some have said there's like a contradiction between Plato and Aristotle, or at least they're like sort of Aristotle's attacking Plato. But then you also suggested you thought that wasn't so much the case. I'm conscious that it's frozen. Can you still hear me?
Oh, I can hear you. Yes, I'm sorry, it's frozen.
So do you think, for one, Plato and Aristotle both seem to reach the same end of talking about this ultimate final good kind of thing. Are there different methods, really contradictory ways of getting to that? Or can we say that they're actually compatible and that this is sort of more, that we can see both as being valid ways of achieving this truth, I guess, and that, yeah. What do you think?
So that's a, I mean, that's a really good question, and it's one of those that are kind of challenging to answer, because that has been the subject of debate for like the past 2,000 years. Is Aristotle compatible with Plato? Are they completely incompatible? You know, if you read some scholars, they're going to tell you they're not compatible at all. Others are going to say, no, actually, they are. Now, what's funny to me is if you look at a lot of the ancient commentators, and we spoke about this a little bit, I think you were there, Daniel, at the beginning before we started the session. We talked about Neoplatonism a little bit. And I mentioned that these commentators on Aristotle, the ancient ones, the so-called Neoplatonic ones, they would spend a lot of time reading and then interpreting Aristotle as a Platonist, and trying to show that actually Aristotle, if you want to understand Plato, you got to understand him first to get to Plato. So there seem to be a lot of ancient thinkers who think that you can synthesize these two approaches. I think you see this in the church fathers and the Greek patristic writers, and then later on in the medieval scholastic tradition. And I think you see that they are synthesizing a lot of the kind of theological speculating you see in Plato's writing, and bringing that together with a lot of the logical reasoning and the kind of empiricism of Aristotle, and they are bringing that together and trying to synthesize those in a kind of creative way. I kind of tend to lean towards that. I like that. I like the Greek fathers, the patristic thinkers. So I do think there's a way to kind of bring these two approaches together creatively. But there's a lot of people who might disagree with that. So it's a very controversial question.
You said earlier that we have a limited amount of Aristotle compared with what the ancients had. So, maybe they were right. I think the Neoplatonists were all, as far as I'm aware, convinced that Aristotle and Plato were in continuity with one another. As indeed, and in the church, all the way up to Aquinas, really. It's only post Aquinas you get the sense that, okay, no, around the time of Aquinas, there are those who are very forcibly suggesting that what they've got of Aristotle is very different from Plato. But it's only around then, isn't it? I mean, until then, I don't think you get many people saying they're opposites, they're opposed to one another, do you? As far as I'm aware.
Can I add to that question as well? By
Yeah.
it seems as in the Nicomachean Ethic, he criticizes quite. It seems to me quite heavily the idea of the world of the forms, or the idea of the form of the good. Maybe you could comment on that as well.
Yeah. So with regard to the first part of the question that Thomas put forth, yeah, I'm inclined. I mean, whenever I read ancient writers, I tend to start leaning towards what they have to say. Maybe to a fault, I don't know. But I tend to think, well, these guys lived and breathed this stuff. I mean, this was their worldview. This is, they could read the original languages. It wasn't a dead language. They were immersed in it in a way that I even, if I spend the rest of my life studying, I probably will never be. So I think it's good to take them seriously when they make these kind of arguments. Having said that, I've seen arguments, made that there's a case to be made that what they were doing was something completely novel. I mean, they weren't always interpreting Aristotle the way Aristotle maybe should be interpreted. They were kind of putting their own spin on it to make it more to fit with Platonism, because they really wanted to reconcile them. So yeah, it's a really tough question to answer from a historical perspective. Now, yeah, so I guess going to what Daniel said, yeah, I mean, obviously you see there, Aristotle doesn't mind, and you see this in a lot of his work, he doesn't mind critiquing Plato at all. He doesn't mind saying, I think he went wrong here. Here's my reasons why. Yeah, it's not a, it doesn't appear to be, at least from the, I guess, the historical evidence, considering how long he stayed in contact with Plato and what other writers have said and that kind of thing. It doesn't appear to be the case that they had a falling out, or that he was like totally against everything Plato said. I think, and even looking at his writings, he seems to try to have a balanced view of here's the good part, here's the bad parts. He does that with a lot of thinkers. He does it with the pre-Socratic thinkers and Socrates and Plato. Now, again, people who specialize like in Aristotle and are immersed in that literature and studying it, they might be able to tell you the nuts and bolts of, well, Aristotle didn't really understand, this thinker, or he wasn't presenting him in the best light, or whatever. We have evidence that maybe Aristotle's account of, whatever, XYZ isn't the same as what this individual actually held. And you can get into those kind of scholarly type debates. But again, I mean, Aristotle's not perfect. But he is doing a good job trying to represent the ideas and critique them. So with Plato, he doesn't think you can start with some kind of pure mathematical forms of the good and then go from there to do ethics. He thinks you need to start with, looking at individual particular things and substances and trying to figure out what their form is and what their activities are, and go from there. And that's just a kind of a difference in methodology and emphasis.
Thank you for that. I can see that Father Plant has his mute off, which suggests to me that he might want to pick you up on one more point. Is that am I reading?
No, that's fine. You've covered what I was thinking about. I'm really just getting into Aristotle after about a 20-year gap for the first time, and I'm interested in seeing how he bridges Plato and the Neoplatonists. I'm now thinking of what I've been reading more recently in Plotinus and seeing some distinctly Aristotelian terms coming up that I haven't spotted, especially contemplation that Lucy brought up. So perhaps when we come on to Plotinus, we can talk about that idea of contemplation of the good a little more. That I look forward to. But fascinating. You've cleared a lot of things up for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Joshua, I think on that basis, especially being conscious of time, it remains for me to thank you immensely. I think I'm, as is so often the case, speaking for far more than myself when I express my appreciation for the way you've led us through the material tonight. I knew when you consented to join us tonight that it wasn't your area of expertise per se, but you've certainly reflected an expertise that I think everybody has found helpful. So thank you immensely. Thank you for being with us. I can say that as your priest up until recently, I miss your presence here, but it's been wonderful to have you join us in this capacity. And I do hope that as we move through material, especially across this first term, but well into the future, you feel free to join us again and again.